To give something in order to receive something. Since the beginning of time, humanity and its peoples have understood this necessary principle. The obvious truth that one cannot receive something in exchange for nothing, that everything has a price, and everything that has a higher value demands a much higher price. For the ancients, nothing obtained without a sacrifice that charged an equal or greater price was worthy of praise. And there were many things that were considered worthy of sacrifice for the sake of a greater good, of the acquiescence and protection of the gods who guarded the villages and all their people, protecting them from misfortune, error, and the fury of their enemies. Calves, goats, pigs, and other animals were slaughtered as an offering to the god-protectors of thousands of nations in the world. Blood, milk, or wine was spilled in the name of these deities to invoke their protection and guidance for the future. And, once conquered, entire cities were dedicated to their names in gratitude for their support during the bloody struggle. But there were peoples who offered sacrifices of a more sinister and dark nature. Forbidden ritual ceremonies, of which no other memory remains than the horror and disgust they aroused in the hearts of those more civilized peoples who would end up conquering their lands after a bath of war, metal, and blood, as if they were trying to erase from the annals of history every last evidence of these ceremonies. Ceremonies where, in search of a greater blessing from the mysterious and misunderstood gods they worshipped, a greater and bloodier price was paid. Human lives. On May 8, 1950, brothers Emil and Viggo Højgaard and Greta Højgaard were cutting peat coal near the village of Tollund, Denmark, when what was thought to be an ordinary day soon became an event they would never forget. A few meters from where they were working, the brothers suddenly noticed the presence of a human face peering through the reddish leaf litter of the bog. Eyes closed, cheeks sunken, and lying in a fetal position, as if sleeping peacefully. Even so, the impression on the peasants would not be small, and suspecting that it was the body of a young student who had been missing for several days, they hurriedly called the authorities. But it was not a team of forensic doctors and criminalists who would pull this corpse out of the old quagmire in which it had rested for longer than anyone could imagine. It would be a team of archaeologists. That corpse, so well preserved that it seemed recent, was at least 2,000 years old. This body, called since then the Tollund Man, was by no means the first nor the last of the many naturally preserved corpses that have come down to our times and have been found over the decades in the ancient cold and icy peat bogs and swamps of the Nordic countries, which have kept them for years as the only witnesses of the dark rituals where the blood of countless people was shed as an offering to the Celtic gods of night, water, forest, and darkness. In the foreground, it would appear that the Tollund Man was robbed and murdered before his death. Beyond the sheepskin cap and the belt on his hip, this corpse had no clothes and a long rope of animal skin had been tightly wrapped around his neck. But there is evidence to suggest that this man was not the victim of abuse and violence before meeting his end, but that, on the contrary, he was well aware of the fate that awaited him before that rope was attached to his neck and tore his life from him. His body seemed to have been carefully laid on the bed of the peat bog, as if his murderers were showing him a last act of respect and gratitude. He was in a fetal position, with his eyes closed and, although the evidence showed hanging as the cause of death, his eyes were not only closed, but there was an expression of acceptance and serenity on his face, as if his life had not been brutally taken from him, and, on the contrary, had been given up willingly. The main proof that this man died as a human sacrifice was, however, in his stomach, where signs of a weed that appears in many of the corpses found in these swamps were found. The Tollund Man is only the best preserved body of those found in these cold lands, and his story is far from being the most shocking of them. human motives and feelings are often confusing and mysterious. Fear, hunger, cold, resignation. It is hard to understand the feelings and ways of thinking of people who lived thousands of years before us. In a world where life, death, and the future of the people in the next generations depended on the judgment of deities of nature and forests, we have no way of knowing what the Grauballe Man was thinking at the moment of his death, 2,500 years ago, although it is probable that he felt cold, hungry, and perhaps resigned when his throat was slit. It is only certain that his death was painful and violent. His leg had been fractured by a violent blow below the knee. His tibia was broken in what was a bulging pile of splintered bone and blood. But his clearest and most deadly wound, the one that led to his death, is still visible on his corpse after thousands of years, hidden under the boggy mixture of dead leaves and earth that gave him rest. A huge gash, stretched from one ear to the other, as if it were a sinister smile. The brutal conditions of his death, as well as the position in which he was found, suggest that he was murdered or executed for a reason that will always be unknown to us. He was found in April 1952, in an uncomfortable position and very distant from the placidity seen in the aforementioned Tollund Man. He was face down with his back arched and his arms and legs bent, which surely indicates that he was thrown into the waters of the swamp as soon as the sharp blade that had led him to his death drew a red mouth under his head. Even so, there is evidence to suggest that perhaps the Grauballe Man was a sacrifice. Like the Tollund Man, his face, preserved for centuries, showed signs of having been shaved shortly before his death, and the analysis of his stomach revealed that his last supper had been a porridge of seeds and cereals with little nutrition, a recipe strangely similar to what had been found in the stomachs of other corpses like these, eternalized by the swamp and given as an eternal gift to the entities worshipped by the Celts. The bogs of northern Europe have been the cause of intrigue, mystery, and speculation. While the incredibly preserved insect-like bodies in small, shiny drops of amber have been found for centuries, it is relatively recent to discover the violence and brutality that has haunted these deaths for thousands of years. Headbutting, stabbing, hanging, strangulation, throat-slitting, and sometimes a mixture of all of these methods are found on virtually any of the bodies that have been unearthed from the mysterious peat bogs of northern Europe. Lindow Man, discovered in 1984, is an example of this. When he was unearthed, there were signs that his death must have been an offering to the deities of the Celtic peoples of England, a gift to their supernatural guardians for the gift of protection from enemies and the health of crops. At the time of his death, he was a young man, about 25 years of age, an age that few people reached in those distant and harsh times when life was most severe. He had been confirmed healthy, with complete teeth and no signs of decay, with well-groomed nails that may suggest a comfortable life away from the arduous and exhausting manual labor of a working man, and with whiskers and sideburns still preserved, as if he had not been buried for 2,000 years under the muddy bed of peat bog. But his death may not have been at all peaceful and pleasant, making us doubt the benevolent or compassionate nature of a god who would demand such a brutality for their lives to be delivered to him. On his head, right at the crown, a 3-centimeter V-shaped incision was found, surely the result of an accurate and precise blow with an axe or some other ritual instrument, which took away his consciousness, fractured his skull, and sent cracked fragments of bone against his brain. But the blows do not seem to have ended there. There were lacerations on the back of his head, as if they were done with the purpose of causing more damage, and his ribs showed a long line of deep fractures. In the upper torso and neck there were deep incisions typical of cuts and stab wounds, and his neck was broken. This body was found thousands of kilometers from Denmark, with nothing to link it to that of the Tollund Man. However, it is important to note that around the neck of the Lindow Man was a long rope made of animal hide, wrapped around his throat and leaving behind a painful trail of marks that do not seem to indicate a peaceful and placid end for this man. It has been theorized that the victims of these sacrifices were not necessarily slaves or prisoners of war, but special and recognized people within their communities. Many of them offered voluntarily as sacrifices to the water gods. People who decided to offer their lives as a bargaining chip to provide a brighter future for their peers. But it is hard to imagine that anyone would be able to willingly offer themselves to such a terrible ordeal and suffer such a bloody and painful death. The body of the Huldremose woman is a clear example of this. A corpse whose etched marks forever border on the violence of a brutal and merciless murder, committed in cold blood against someone at a disadvantage. Her body, desiccated, dark, and eternalized by the conditions of the swamp, bears the gruesome and deep wounds that can only be made by brutality. The axes scattered across her body attest to the bloody and sinister scene that took place more than 2,000 years ago in distant and frozen Denmark. Her right arm was found severed from her body, with what looks hopefully like black crooked stumps that are nothing more than the bones broken at the point of blows to her arm. But there is another reason to think that perhaps this woman was not the chosen offering to satisfy some swamp god, but the victim of murder. On her face, preserved enough so that her human features are perfectly recognizable, we read an expression of horror and anguish, as all hope seems distant, elusive, and therefore unattainable. We have no way of knowing what moments preceded this woman's death, whether her life was brutally taken from her at the hands of a merciless and ferocious soul, or whether she gave it up voluntarily, driven by the belief she had held in life. The only thing that is evident is that the final moments of her existence must have been an agonizing and painful experience, until the very last moment. There are those who think that these people sacrificed in the muddy lands of northern Europe were considered unique and special individuals, masters of a status that made them stand out among their peers. Some analysis of the body of the Huldremose woman suggests that, unlike the male corpses, she was dressed in luxurious and rare clothing for the time, suggesting that she may have travelled and seen the world before her death. In addition to the hundreds of bodies in the peat box, rings, ornaments, trumpets, cauldrons, swords, and other valuables that were given as offerings have been found. So it is likely that, rather than a victim of abuse, the Woman of Huldremose was nothing more than a figure of value and prominence to the people for whom, either willingly or by choice, she sacrificed herself. Before I conclude this video, I just want to say thank you for choosing to watch it, and I hope you're enjoying my narration. If you feel like I'm worthy of a hit to that like button and your subscription to my channel, it would be hugely appreciated. Also, if you want to support my mission to become a full-time storyteller, please check out the link in the video description to an audiobook I narrated on Audible. You can get it for free by signing up for Audible's 30-day free trial, and you'll be really helping me out. If you love horror, you'll love this novel. The Celtic and Scandinavian peoples were not necessarily an extremely bloodthirsty and warlike people. This is more a possible exaggeration of the Romans and other conquering peoples who sought to make themselves look more noble and humane than those they faced. But violence, cruelty, and other dark emotions crawl in the hearts of men waiting for any opportunity to come out and give free rein to their darker, primitive, and animal side. These people had a way of understanding and interpreting the world very different from today, and even different from those of the Romans, Greeks, and the more advanced civilizations against which they lost. Among their gods, there were few that had human or animal form, although they saw them present in the whole world around them. The forests, the rivers, the seasons, the rebirth of the countryside after the freezing winter. Some of these deities were virtuous representations of light, sun, spring, and abundance. But others were sort of masks of the more ruthless side of nature and the human heart. And there were especially three gods: the sky and lightning god Tyrannus, the fierce warrior god Teutates, and Essus, the god of nature and forests. These deities were known as the three gods of night and darkness. And while they offered guidance and protection in times of need, they demanded a costly price for these blessings. One that was paid with blood and agony, sometimes of the people themselves, sometimes of prisoners of war or slaves. It is unlikely that any of the bodies sacrificed in these swamps were a gift to Tyrannus, for the victims who were delivered to him suffered another kind of death, a slower and more painful one. The prisoners of war were tied to a great pyre of leaves and dried branches, to which they were set on fire to be fiercely and savagely consumed to death, with the raging flames crawling around the desiccated pile of dead vegetation and slowly beginning to devour the victim's flesh, skin, bones, and hair until nothing was left but a charred, dying body, of which nothing more than a glimmer of humanity remained, and a god of war, only slightly less furious than a few moments ago. The other bloodthirsty god was Essus, guardian of forests and nature, whose victims did not expect a more placid or serene fate during their last moments. Sources say that all the unfortunate ones who were unlucky enough to become offerings for this dark and formless deity were tied headfirst to the top of a great tree, where death would await them. This action alone would constitute a torture of the worst nature, abandoning them to a slow death at the mercy of the elements. It is probable that this was the sacrifice, to leave the victim at the mercy of the god of nature so that he would slowly consume and devour him at will, until nothing was left but an empty and agonizing shell. But there are sources that speak of a quicker condemnation and therefore perhaps more compassionate than leaving him out in the open, but not without pain. The victims, tied upside down, received whip after whip. A stream of brutal blows followed one after the other, and ending with the body of the offering turned into a lump of pending bruises, gyres of skin and bloody muscles hanging from the body, incomprehensible murmurs of pain, flies fluttering through the air in search of food, and a trail of thick scarlet flowing from thousands of wounds, sliding down the entirety of his skin and spilled on the ground in a large red stain delivered to the deity. But the most prominent of this bloodthirsty and dark trinity of Celtic gods, the one to whom probably hundreds of the bodies found centuries later in the marshes were dedicated to, was Teutates. Most sources state that sacrifices to this god were made by submerging the victim headfirst in a large jar filled with an unspecified liquid, where he would struggle for his life in a desperate and unsuccessful attempt to escape, while the burning and exhaustion of the lungs and respiratory tract spread through the body until his consciousness and life were snatched away. For many of these peoples, the lakes, swamps, and deep forests were places of magic, sacredness, and getaways to the land of spirits, gods, and souls waiting impatiently for their return to the mortal world. Time moves ever on, merciless and indifferent. Centuries fall upon centuries, relegating to oblivion the stories of millions upon millions of lives that are lost in the midst of the past, piling up lost histories of which little more than mere dots have come down to us that we will never know much about. It is impossible to know the detail of the story of hundreds of bodies that suffered such brutality over centuries, in a time long before any vestige of the society we know began to take shape. From pre-Roman Ireland and England to the frozen peat bogs of Denmark and Germany, hundreds of bodies are found as witnesses and victims of bloody and brutal ceremonies. Strangled and fragmented necks, broken skulls, deep stab wounds in necks, arms, breasts and backs, and victims who are not distinguishable between sex or gender, and who are suspected to be slaves, prisoners of war, respected travellers, or even fallen kings. The pain and agony that characterized these violent scenes from several thousand years of history ago was a dark reality about which we can only make assumptions and conjectures, knowing deep down that no matter how great the confines of human imagination, reality, past, present, or future, always far surpasses it. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I know there is a ton of content out there, and I'm sincerely appreciative for you watching this right through to the end. If you enjoyed it, please go ahead and hit the like button, and if you don't already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and select the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of my future uploads. Also, please leave a comment on this video letting me know what you thought of it. Comments really help with the YouTube algorithm and will really help my channel to grow. You can also let me know what type of videos you would like to see more of on this channel. That really helps me branch out into new subject matters. If you have a story you would like me to tell on this channel, please email it to me at stories@daredevril.com. If you want to support my channel even further, there are a number of ways you can do so. You can buy me a coffee via my Ko-fi account, or simply help me out by sharing my content with anyone you might think is interested in watching it. Thanks again.